The phone call no parent ever wants to receive began with a simple question: has Mary Kay come home? 17-year-old Mary Kay Heese had left for work like she had so many times before. She was a kind-hearted high school student with a bright future, and nothing about that March evening suggested her family was about to face the worst night of their lives. By sunrise, a quiet Nebraska town had become the center of a homicide investigation that left detectives with more questions than answers. The evidence offered fragments of a story, but never enough to reveal who was responsible. Every promising lead seemed to fade just as hope began to grow. For the next 55 years, Mary Kay's name refused to be forgotten. Then, when nearly everyone believed the truth had been lost to history, one unexpected breakthrough forced investigators to ask a chilling question. Had the answer been waiting for them all along? Some stories refuse to disappear, not because they are the most famous, not because they are the most mysterious, but because somewhere, a family has spent decades waiting for the day someone finally says, "We know what happened." On the evening of March 25, 1969, a 17-year-old Nebraska high school student climbed into her family's car and headed to work, just as she had done many times before. She had plans, she had dreams, she was only months away from finishing another year of high school. But before the night was over, the small farming community of Wahoo would lose one of its own. For the next 55 years, her name would echo through court records, newspaper headlines, detective notebooks, and family conversations. Generations of investigators would inherit her file. Hundreds of interviews would be conducted. Evidence would be revisited again and again. Then, more than half a century later, a breakthrough would finally arrive, bringing long-awaited answers, but also a painful debate over what justice should look like after 55 years. This is the story of Mary Kay Heese, a daughter, a sister, a classmate, a friend, and a young woman whose memory never faded from the hearts of those who loved her. Wait a minute, before we continue, I noticed that only a small percentage of people watching are actually subscribed. If you're fascinated by true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the psychological puzzles behind them, subscribe now, because the next case might leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Now let's get back to Mary Kay Heese's story. In 1969, Wahoo, Nebraska was the kind of town where life moved at a gentle pace. Located about 30 miles west of Omaha, it was a close-knit farming community where neighbors greeted one another by name and Friday night football games brought the town together. Parents rarely worried when their children drove across town. Students worked after school, helped on family farms, attended church on Sundays, and imagined futures that stretched far beyond graduation. People believed they knew one another. That sense of trust defined daily life, which is exactly why what happened on March 25 sent shockwaves through the entire community, because crimes like this weren't supposed to happen in Wahoo. Before she became the subject of one of Nebraska's longest-running homicide investigations, Mary Kay Heese was simply a 17-year-old teenager enjoying the ordinary moments of life. She was a junior at Wahoo High School, where classmates remembered her as friendly, dependable, and hardworking. She balanced school with a part-time job, a responsibility that reflected the values she had grown up with. Family meant everything to Mary Kay. She shared a close bond with her parents and siblings, and like many teenagers, she was beginning to imagine what life might look like after high school. Those who knew her described someone who carried herself with kindness. She wasn't someone who sought attention. She was the kind of person who quietly made life better for those around her. To her parents, she wasn't a headline. She was their daughter. The chair at the dinner table, the familiar voice in the hallway, the smile that made a house feel like home. It is important to remember Mary Kay that way, because long before this became a criminal investigation, it was a family losing someone they loved beyond words. Tuesday, March 25, 1969, began like countless other school days. Students attended classes, teachers prepared lessons, businesses opened their doors. Nothing suggested that the day would become one of the darkest in Saunders County's history. After school, Mary Kay prepared for her evening shift at a local restaurant. She borrowed the family car, something that had become part of her normal routine. There was nothing unusual about her plans. She expected to work her shift, then drive home. It was a route she knew well. A drive she had made before. a journey no one imagined would become her last. As evening turned to night, something began to feel wrong. Mary Kay hadn't returned home. At first, there was hope that perhaps she'd been delayed. Maybe work had run late. Maybe she'd stopped to visit a friend. Maybe there had been an unexpected change of plans. But as the minutes became hours, those possibilities grew harder to believe. For parents, there is a moment when concern quietly becomes fear. The familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway never came. The front door never opened. The house remained painfully quiet. Her family knew something wasn't right. And before long, authorities were notified that Mary Kay was missing. Word spread quickly through Wahoo. Friends, neighbors, law enforcement officers. Everyone hoped there would be a simple explanation. Search efforts began almost immediately. Officers retraced Mary Kay's expected route. They spoke with coworkers. They questioned friends and classmates. They searched roads, ditches, and nearby areas where someone or something might provide a clue. Every hour that passed increased the urgency. The optimism that had filled the first stages of the search slowly gave way to an unsettling realization. This was no longer just a missing person investigation. Something far more serious had happened. The following day, March 26, 1969, the search came to a devastating end. Mary Kay Heese was found deceased in rural Saunders County. The discovery stunned investigators. Almost instantly, the investigation shifted from finding a missing teenager to identifying the person responsible for taking her life. Crime scene investigators worked carefully to preserve every piece of evidence they could. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, physical evidence collected. Detectives knew the smallest detail might one day identify the offender. They could not have known that this investigation would continue for more than 5 decades. Or that some of the evidence they preserved would remain central to the case 55 years later. Every homicide investigation begins with a promise to the victim, a promise to the family. A promise that no matter how difficult the investigation becomes, the search for truth will continue. For the detectives who first responded in March of 1969, that promise seemed straightforward. Find the person responsible, present the evidence, seek justice. None of them imagined that many would retire before that promise was fulfilled. Some would never live to see the breakthrough. Others, detectives not even born in 1969, would one day inherit the case and carry that promise forward. Because although evidence can wait, families never stop waiting. In the next chapter, we'll examine the first crucial days of the investigation. We'll follow detectives as they reconstruct Mary Kay's final movements, process the crime scene, interview hundreds of witnesses, and begin one of the largest homicide investigations in Nebraska history. An investigation that would eventually span more than half a century before revealing its final answer. When the sun rose over Saunders County on the morning after Mary Kay Heese disappeared, investigators faced a heartbreaking reality. A 17-year-old girl had left for work, expecting to return home. Instead, an entire community was waking up to a tragedy that would define Nebraska law enforcement for decades. For Mary Kay's family, time seemed to stop. For detectives, it was just beginning. The next few days would become a race against time. A race to preserve evidence, identify witnesses, and answer one question that haunted everyone involved: who had crossed paths with Mary Kay on her final night? The area where Mary Kay was found quickly became the focus of an intensive investigation. Crime scene investigators documented every detail with the methods available in 1969. Every photograph, every footprint, every tire impression, every item of physical evidence. Nothing was considered too insignificant. Detectives understood that homicide investigations are often solved not by one dramatic discovery, but by dozens of small details that eventually fit together. They carefully collected clothing, trace evidence, and biological material, preserving everything they believed might one day become important. It was meticulous work that would prove invaluable decades later. Because while forensic science in 1969 had limitations, experienced investigators knew one thing: evidence should never be discarded simply because today's technology cannot explain it. As one team processed the crime scene, another began reconstructing Mary Kay's last known movements. Detectives interviewed everyone they could identify: her parents, her siblings, friends from school, teachers, co-workers, customers who may have seen her during her shift. motorists who had traveled the same roads that evening. Every interview helped establish another piece of the timeline. Investigators wanted to know, who saw Mary Kay leave work? Was she alone? Did anyone notice another vehicle following her? Did anyone observe suspicious activity along her usual route home? These questions became the foundation of the investigation. And over the months that followed, detectives would ask them hundreds of times. As public concern grew, so did the investigation. The Saunders County Sheriff's Office worked alongside the Nebraska State Patrol and other agencies, devoting significant resources to the case. Over the years, investigators conducted more than 700 interviews. Some people were interviewed only once. Others were questioned repeatedly as detectives revisited old leads and compared new information against the original evidence. Every promising lead was followed. Every credible tip was investigated. Some appeared encouraging at first. Others quickly reached dead ends. This is the reality of long-term homicide investigations. For every lead that moves the case forward, dozens may ultimately lead nowhere. Yet each one must be examined with the same care. Because investigators never know which conversation might hold the missing piece. As detectives continued gathering information, one individual repeatedly drew investigative attention. He had been known to law enforcement. His statements were carefully reviewed. Over the years, detectives returned to him more than once, as they continued examining the evidence. Importantly, however, suspicion alone is never enough. Investigators needed evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. Without that evidence, they could not file charges. So, although detectives continued exploring every avenue, the investigation remained incomplete. The person they believed warranted further attention could not yet be linked to the crime through the forensic methods available at the time. That gap would haunt the case for decades. As the months turned into years, the investigation entered its most difficult phase. Witnesses moved away. Some passed on. Memories became less certain. Businesses closed. Roads changed. Even the landscape where investigators searched evolved over time. The passage of years presents challenges that every cold case detective understands. Evidence must be preserved. Files must be maintained. And every conclusion must continue to be supported by facts, not assumptions. Although public attention gradually faded, the case itself never disappeared. Inside evidence rooms and filing cabinets, Mary Kay's investigation remained active, waiting. For Mary Kay's family, the investigation became part of everyday life. Each anniversary brought renewed memories. Each birthday served as a reminder of the years she never had the opportunity to live. Her loved ones stayed in contact with investigators, hoping that one phone call might finally bring the answers they had waited so long to hear. The uncertainty was its own kind of burden. Not knowing who was responsible, not knowing whether justice would ever come. Yet despite the passing decades, they never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, still held the truth. Many homicide cases lose momentum over time. Mary Kay Heese's case was different. Successive generations of investigators inherited the file. Each detective brought fresh eyes, fresh questions, fresh determination. The evidence collected in 1969 was reviewed again and again. Not because earlier investigators had failed, but because science kept evolving. And with every advance in forensic technology, detectives asked themselves the same question. Could today's science answer yesterday's mystery? Eventually, the answer would become yes. For more than 50 years, one crucial piece of evidence quietly waited inside an evidence locker. Then advances in modern forensic DNA testing gave investigators a second chance. The suspect detectives had interviewed years earlier would once again come under the microscope. But this time, science could do what memory never could. Mary Kay Heese's family had imagined one moment. The day they would sit inside a courtroom and finally hear the evidence presented before a jury. The day someone would be held publicly accountable. The indictment in 2024 seemed to bring that moment within reach. After decades of waiting, the criminal justice system was finally moving forward. But as every prosecutor and defense attorney knows, an indictment is not the end of a case. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one that can take unexpected turns. And in Mary Kay's case, one of the biggest twists was still to come. Following the grand jury indictment, James Dean appeared before the court to answer the charge. As in every criminal case in the United States, he was presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's responsibility was clear. Present evidence demonstrating that Dean was responsible for Mary Kay Heese's 1969 murder. The defense, meanwhile, had the opportunity to challenge that evidence, question witnesses, and test the reliability of forensic findings developed decades after the crime. It was shaping up to become one of Nebraska's most closely watched homicide prosecutions. Not only because of the age of the case, but because it would test whether evidence preserved for more than half a century could withstand the scrutiny of a modern courtroom. Behind the scenes, both sides began preparing. Prosecutors organized decades of investigative records. Witness statements collected over multiple generations of detectives had to be reviewed once again. Forensic experts prepared to explain modern DNA analysis in a way jurors could understand. Investigators who had spent years reopening the case stood ready to describe how the evidence had led them to James Dean. The defense likewise examined every aspect of the investigation. Cases this old present unique legal challenges. Witnesses may no longer be available. Memories naturally fade. Some original investigators have retired or passed away. Physical evidence must be shown to have been properly preserved through every stage of the investigation. Every detail matters. The age of the case makes precision even more important. As the case moved through the court system, discussions began between prosecutors and the defense. These conversations are common in criminal cases. Sometimes they lead nowhere. Other times, they result in negotiated agreements that avoid the uncertainty of a trial. Eventually, prosecutors announced that they had reached a plea agreement with James Dean. Instead of asking a jury to decide the case after a lengthy trial, the prosecution accepted a negotiated resolution. For many observers, the announcement came as a surprise. After waiting 55 years for a trial, the case would not end the way many had expected. To many members of the public, plea agreements can seem confusing. If prosecutors believe they have a strong case, why negotiate? The answer varies from case to case. Prosecutors must weigh many factors, including the available evidence, the likelihood of securing a conviction, the age of witnesses, the interests of victims' families, and the uncertainty that comes with any jury trial. A negotiated plea removes the risk that a jury could acquit the defendant entirely. It also brings the criminal proceedings to a conclusion without the delays that often accompany lengthy trials and appeals. That does not mean everyone agrees with the decision. In fact, plea agreements in serious criminal cases often generate strong emotions from victims' families and the public alike. Mary Kay Heese's case was no exception. For Mary Kay's loved ones, simply reaching this stage of the legal process was something they had waited more than half a century to see. But the plea agreement brought complicated emotions. There was relief that the case had finally reached a legal resolution. There was appreciation for the investigators who had never stopped working. Yet there was also disappointment. Many family members had hoped to hear the evidence presented publicly before a jury. They had prepared themselves for a trial that would tell the full story in open court. Instead, the legal proceedings took a different path. The agreement closed the criminal case. But for some members of the family, it did not fully satisfy the hope they had carried for 55 years. News of the plea agreement spread quickly across Nebraska. Some believed it was the most practical resolution given the extraordinary age of the case. Others questioned whether justice had been fully served. These differing reactions reflected the difficult balance prosecutors often face in cold case prosecutions. After decades have passed, there are rarely perfect outcomes. There are only difficult decisions made within the framework of the law. Even so, one fact remained unchanged. Mary Kay Heese's case was no longer an unsolved mystery. After 55 years, the investigation had reached a legal conclusion. For more than half a century, Mary Kay Heese's family waited for this moment. They imagined sitting in a courtroom. They imagined hearing every piece of evidence. They imagined finally learning everything investigators had uncovered after 55 years. Most of all, they imagined that the person responsible would be held fully accountable. Instead, what unfolded inside the Saunders County Courthouse left many of them walking away with emotions they never expected. The case had reached its legal conclusion, but for those who loved Mary Kay, the search for peace was far from over. In July 2025, the court accepted a negotiated resolution in the case. Rather than proceeding to trial on the original first-degree murder charge, Joseph Ambrose entered a no-contest plea to the lesser offense of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Under Nebraska law, as it existed in 1969, that offense carried a maximum sentence of 2 years imprisonment, which became the maximum penalty available under the agreement. For many following the case as it unfolds, the announcement came as a surprise. The family had spent decades believing a jury would one day hear the evidence. Instead, there would be no opening statements, no witness testimony, no cross-examinations, no verdict after trial. The case ended with a plea. Legally, the criminal proceedings had reached their conclusion. Emotionally, however, many questions remained unanswered. Soon after the plea agreement became public, Saunders County Attorney Jennifer Joachim explained why prosecutors believed the agreement was appropriate. She acknowledged the extraordinary challenges of trying a homicide more than 55 years after it occurred. Some witnesses had died. Others could no longer clearly remember events from 1969. Certain evidentiary issues had become more difficult because of the passage of time. Even when investigators strongly believe they know what happened, prosecutors must still consider whether they can prove every element of the charge beyond a reasonable doubt before a jury. According to prosecutors, the plea agreement ensured a criminal conviction rather than risking the possibility that the case could end without one after a lengthy trial. It was a decision based on legal realities, but not everyone agreed that it was the right one. Outside the courthouse, Mary Kay's relatives spoke openly about their disappointment. Some said they felt shocked, others described feeling hurt and angry. Several family members believed they had waited 55 years, expecting a full public trial, only to see the case resolved without hearing all of the evidence presented in court. They also expressed frustration that the plea did not require Ambrose to explain what happened that night or identify anyone else who may have been involved. One relative described the outcome as an insult all the way around. Another said the family felt they had been taken back to March of 1969 because so many questions still remained unanswered. Their words reflected a difficult truth about many cold cases. Sometimes solving the case does not answer every question. Sometimes identifying a suspect is not the same as fully understanding the crime. At the sentencing hearing, members of Mary Kay's family addressed the court through victim impact statements. They spoke not only about the loss of a 17-year-old girl in 1969, but also about the decades of grief their family had carried ever since. Mary Kay's absence had been felt at graduations, at weddings, at holiday celebrations, at every family gathering where someone quietly noticed the place she should have occupied. The court imposed the maximum sentence permitted under the applicable 1969 conspiracy statute, 2 years in prison. Because Nebraska law also allowed reductions for good time and credit for time already served, Ambrose ultimately served substantially less than 2 full years in custody. For many observers, the sentence reflected the legal constraints governing an offense committed decades earlier. For Mary Kay's family, it felt painfully inadequate. Among those most affected by the outcome was one of the lead investigators who had devoted years to the case. After spending countless hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and helping bring the investigation to its conclusion, he had hoped the evidence would be presented before a jury. Instead, the plea agreement marked the end of the prosecution. Although investigators remained proud that the case had finally been solved, some publicly acknowledged that they wished the legal process had unfolded differently. It was a reminder that investigators and prosecutors often carry different responsibilities. Detectives search for the truth. Prosecutors must decide what can be proven under the law. Those responsibilities do not always produce the outcome everyone hopes for. When the courthouse emptied, one question lingered. What does justice really mean after 55 years? Is it identifying the person responsible? Is it obtaining a conviction? Is it hearing every fact presented before a jury? Or is it simply ensuring that a victim's name is never forgotten? The plea agreement in the Mary Kay Heese case remains one of the most debated aspects of the investigation because it reflects the difficult balance between legal certainty and the pursuit of complete justice. After 55 years, prosecutors were no longer deciding whether a crime had occurred. They were deciding whether the available evidence could still secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt before a modern jury. Under the American justice system, prosecutors are ethically obligated not simply to win cases, but to pursue justice based on evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny. A major factor was the age of the case. Although the prosecution occurred in 2025, the offense was committed in 1969. Under the ex post facto clauses of the U.S. Constitution, courts cannot apply newer criminal statutes or harsher punishments to conduct that occurred decades earlier. As a result, prosecutors and the court were legally bound by the Nebraska laws and sentencing framework that existed in 1969, significantly limiting the options available. The passage of 55 years also created serious evidentiary challenges. Memories fade, witnesses pass away, and physical evidence becomes more difficult to explain before a jury. While advances in DNA technology strengthened the investigation, prosecutors still had to consider whether the entire case could satisfy the constitutional standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, established by the U.S. Supreme Court in re Winship in 1970. A strong investigation does not automatically guarantee a conviction. This is where prosecutorial discretion became critical. Under long-standing U.S. legal principles, prosecutors have the authority to negotiate plea agreements when they believe doing so better serves the interests of justice than risking an uncertain trial. Similarly, in Borden-Kircher v. Plea Heese case in 1978, the Supreme Court recognized plea bargaining as a legitimate and essential part of the criminal justice system. In fact, the overwhelming majority of criminal convictions in America result from negotiated pleas rather than jury verdicts. Supporters of the agreement argue that the plea guaranteed accountability. Had prosecutors taken the case to trial and failed to convince all 12 jurors, an acquittal would have triggered the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment, permanently preventing another prosecution for the same offense. From that perspective, securing a conviction, even through a plea, was preferable to risking the complete collapse of the case. Critics, however, believe the agreement came at a significant emotional cost. Mary Kay's family had waited more than 5 decades expecting a public trial where all the evidence would be presented, witnesses examined, and the full story told in open court. A plea agreement brought the legal proceedings to an end but left many of those questions unanswered, making the resolution feel incomplete despite the conviction. The sentence also became a point of controversy. Because the court was required to sentence under the law applicable to the offense at the time it was committed, the judge could not impose a punishment beyond what the 1969 statute allowed. This highlights an important principle of American criminal law. Judges sentence according to statutory limits, not public sentiment or the age of the case. Ultimately, the Mary Kay Heese case demonstrates that legal justice and emotional justice are not always the same. Investigators fulfilled their promise by solving one of Nebraska's oldest unsolved murders, while prosecutors secured a lawful conviction within constitutional limits. Yet for Mary Kay's family, the absence of a full trial meant that justice, although legally achieved, never felt entirely complete. There are no easy answers, but Mary Kay Heese's case demonstrated one undeniable truth. Even after half a century, the pursuit of truth never stopped. When Mary Kay Heese left school on March 25, 1969, no one imagined her name would still be spoken in courtrooms more than half a century later. Generations changed. Technology transformed the way crimes are investigated. Entire careers in law enforcement began and ended while her case remained unsolved. Yet through all those years, one thing never changed. Her family never stopped remembering. And investigators never completely stopped searching. That persistence became the defining legacy of this remarkable case. One of the most extraordinary aspects of Mary Kay's case wasn't simply that it was solved, it was how it was solved. The deputies who first responded in 1969 could never have imagined the forensic tools available today. Yet they understood something timeless. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Preserving every possible clue matters. Because someday, someone may be able to see what today's investigators cannot. Over the next 55 years, that original work was carried forward by countless detectives, Nebraska State Patrol investigators, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and analysts. Some retired before seeing the case reach court. Others never lived to witness the indictment. But each added another chapter to the investigation. Justice, in this case, was not the work of one detective. It was the work of generations. For many Nebraskans, Mary Kay's story became deeply personal. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a public figure. She was a 17-year-old high school student from a small community. People saw their own daughters, their sisters, their classmates, their friends. That is why, even after decades, local residents continued following developments in the investigation. The case became a reminder that victims are never just names in police files. They are people whose absence continues to shape the lives of those who loved them. Throughout the investigation, Mary Kay's relatives became some of the strongest advocates for keeping the case alive. They spoke publicly, they supported investigators, they attended hearings, and when the plea agreement left them feeling disappointed, they didn't hide those emotions. Their reaction reflected something many families experience in long-delayed prosecutions. A legal conclusion does not always bring emotional resolution. Justice in a courtroom and healing within a family are not always the same thing. Even so, their determination ensured that Mary Kay's memory remained at the center of the story, not merely the legal proceedings. Their message was clear. They wanted the public to remember who Mary Kay was, not simply how her life ended. Every investigation leaves lessons behind. Mary Kay Heese's case offers several that continue to matter today. Cold cases are not forgotten cases. Advances in forensic science, combined with persistent investigative work, continue to solve crimes once thought impossible to resolve. This case also showed that preserving evidence can make all the difference. Items collected in 1969 remained valuable more than 5 decades later because investigators protected them with extraordinary care. Also, communities matter. Small-town investigations often rely on people willing to come forward, share information, and support law enforcement, even many years after a crime. Finally, the pursuit of justice requires patience. Sometimes answers arrive quickly, sometimes they take decades. But every victim deserves that effort. Before she became the focus of one of Nebraska's longest-running homicide investigations, Mary Kay Heese was simply a teenager, a daughter who left home expecting to return, a student looking toward the future. A young woman with dreams that deserved the chance to become reality. That is how she should be remembered. Not only as the victim of a crime, but as someone whose life touched an entire community. Her story reminds us that behind every cold case is a family that continues to celebrate birthdays, remember anniversaries, and wonder what might have been. Those memories never become cold. The story of Mary Kay Heese is ultimately about more than a criminal investigation. It is about the enduring power of hope. It is about detectives who refused to close a file simply because it had grown old. It is about prosecutors willing to pursue one of Nebraska's oldest homicide cases. It is about forensic science continuing to evolve. And it is about a family that never stopped believing Mary Kay deserved answers. While opinions may differ about the legal outcome, one truth remains beyond dispute. Mary Kay Heese's life mattered. Her story mattered. And because so many people refuse to let time erase her memory, future generations will know not only that her case challenged investigators for decades, but also that she was a young woman whose life was worthy of being remembered. Every case leaves behind questions, and sometimes more than one possible explanation. Now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think really happened? Do you agree with the investigators' conclusions, or is there something that doesn't quite add up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and some of the best discussions happen there. If you enjoyed deeply researched true crime documentaries that treat every victim's story with the care and respect it deserves, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. Here is another gripping case filled with twists, unanswered questions, and shocking revelations. I'll see you there.